Hi, hello, vanakkam, and welcome back to yet another episode on a Little Slaw YouTube channel. And today you are in the day 5 of the upskilling of your performance testing and engineering skills. So please don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like, and share the video with your friends. So now we will see the first topic, the first part of this topic, which is the identification of the performance acceptance criteria. So, the performance acceptance criteria are the measurable benchmarks that define what constitutes acceptable performance for an application. And this performance acceptance criteria is very crucial to identify or to estimate these criteria early in the development life cycle to ensure that the application meets the performance expectations of users and stakeholders. Since most of the times the performance test is very involved at the end, I would say exactly after the functional testing is over or during the functional testing is in progress. But the performance testing should be part of the development life cycle because that will help us to ensure that the application meets the performance expectations of the users and stakeholders by identifying the estimates very early in the development life cycle. Okay, so now to begin with, we should gather the input from the stakeholders and the users to understand their expectations regarding the application performance. So we should start gathering it, and that's very important at this point of time to understand how does the application should perform. And this can include factors such as the response times, the throughput, the concurrency, and the resource utilization. Say, for example, your stakeholder might expect the application to load within 3 seconds. Exactly, every stakeholder would want the application to load within 3 seconds, but what actually happens, we all know. And the application should handle 1000 concurrent users or it should process 100 transactions per second. So we have to make in a way, or we have to tune in a way that we have to achieve it. But still, we want to understand the benchmark. We have to know what is the stakeholder's expectation. So they again, I'm telling, reiterating it. So the stakeholder might expect the application to load within 3 seconds, handle 1000 concurrent users, or process 100 transactions per second. So once we have gathered all these expectations, that is the response times, the throughput, we can quantify them into specific performance targets. So, for instance, we might set a target for the application to load the page within a certain time frame, such as under 2 seconds for most pages and under 5 seconds for complex pages. Similarly, we might establish targets for response times for various transactions or API calls. And these quantified targets serves as our performance acceptance criteria, and they provide clear goals for the development and the testing teams to work towards. And this will ensure that the application meets the desired performance standards. So, throughout the development and testing process, we will continuously monitor and evaluate the application's performance against these criteria, making adjustments as necessary to optimize the performance and meet expectations. So overall, in the very first part of this video, the performance criteria are the measurable benchmarks that define the acceptable performance for an application. And by identifying these criteria early and quantifying them into specific targets, we can ensure that the application meets the performance expectations of users and stakeholders. So now moving on to the response times. So response time. So this refers to the time taken by the system to respond. So why I'm taking you through all these part is you should understand the key factors which directly impact the user satisfaction with the application. So I will just take you through this with an example. So first part is the response time. So this refers to the time taken by the system to respond to a user's action. Say for example, if you have an e-commerce application or testing an e-commerce application and the users expect the product catalog to be displayed promptly, and a performance acceptance criteria for response time could be that the product catalog must be displayed in less than 3 seconds, and this ensures that the users can quickly browse through the catalog without experiencing delays, leading to a positive user experience. The second part is throughput. So throughput measures the rate at which the system can handle a certain number of transactions or requests per unit of time. Say, for instance, in an online bookstore, users expect the system to support a high volume of book orders during peak hours. A performance acceptance criteria for throughput could be that the system must support 25 book orders per second, and this ensures that the application can handle the expected load without experiencing bottlenecks or slowdowns by maintaining smooth operations even during peak periods. And moving on to the next part, which is resource utilization. So, efficient resource utilization is essential for optimal system performance and scalability, and resources such as CPU, memory, disk, IO, and network IO need to be carefully managed to prevent resource exhaustion and degradation in performance. Say, for example, so I always bring up with an example that'll be easy for you to understand. So, in this example, for the part of resource utilization, so in a cloud-based application, we might set a performance acceptance criteria that processor utilization should not exceed 75%. And this ensures that sufficient resources are available to handle user requests and maintain responsiveness. So overall, about these three key metrics, so these classes or characteristics including response time, throughput and resource utilization are critical factors in determining user satisfaction with an application. So by setting clear objectives and performance acceptance criteria for each of these characteristics, we can ensure that the application meets user expectations for performance, reliability, and scalability. And now moving on to the next part. So we have a lot of key points to consider when identifying the performance criteria. So out of which the first point is the business requirements. So the performance criteria should align with the overarching business objectives and goals of the organization. And by understanding the business requirements will help us to ensure that the performance testing efforts are focused on areas that directly impact the business success. And for an example, suppose we are developing an e-commerce platform. One of the business requirement is to ensure that the website can handle a high volume of simultaneous users during peak shopping seasons like Black Friday without crashing. So that's the business requirement. And coming back to the user expectations, so it's essential to consider the performance expectations of end users. And this involves gathering feedback from users or stakeholders to understand their performance expectations and ensuring that the application meets or exceeds these expectations. Coming back to the examples, based on the user feedback, customers expect the checkout process to be completed within 30 seconds to avoid frustration and cart abandonment. And the third point here is the contractual obligations. So, criteria may be defined in contractual agreements with clients, with the partners, or with the vendors. So, these obligations must be considered when identifying the performance criteria to ensure compliance and avoid penalties. So coming back to an example, so usually the contract with a client specifies that the application must maintain an average response time of less than 1 second for all its API requests. And moving to the fourth point, which is the regulatory compliance criteria and industry standards. Compliance with regulatory requirements and adherence to industry standards are crucial for ensuring the security, their reliability, and the integrity of their application. So, performance criteria should align with relevant regulations and standards applicable to the industry. And coming back to the example, so there could be a requirement that the application must comply with the GDPR regulations, which require that user data be processed securely and efficiently. So, now moving on to the next set of key points. So we have the service level agreements, which we call as SLAs. So SLAs define the expected level of service and the performance targets agreed upon between service providers and the customers, and the performance criteria should be defined to meet or exceed the SLAs to ensure customer satisfaction and maintain the contractual obligations. And for example, we might have an SLA with customer states that the website uptime must be 99.9% and that the pages should load within 2 seconds under normal traffic conditions. And moving on to the sixth point, the key point, which is the resource utilization targets. So setting targets for resource utilization such as CPU, memory, disk IO, and the network bandwidth helps to optimize the system performance and ensure efficient resource management. And when coming for an example, so we aim to keep the CPU utilization below 80% and the memory usage below 70%, not during the normal time, but during the peak load to ensure optimal performance and system ability. And now moving on to the seventh key point, which is the workload models. So creating realistic workload models that represent various user behaviors and usage patterns helps simulate real world scenarios accurately during performance testing. And for an example, we create workload models that simulate various scenarios such as browsing products, adding items to the cart, and checking out to mimic real world user behavior during performance testing. And then the anticipated load conditions. So, considering the entire range of anticipated load conditions, including normal, peak, and stress conditions, ensures that the application can perform optimally under different circumstances. Coming back to the example, so we anticipate a surge in traffic during holiday sales events and simulate high loads to ensure the application can handle the increased demand without performance degradation. And now moving on to the next part where we discuss about the system stress conditions. So identifying the stress conditions and understanding how the system behaves under extreme load helps us to uncover performance bottlenecks and weaknesses that may impact the system ability. And for an example, so during stress testing, we intentionally overload the system beyond its capacity to identify the bottlenecks and the weaknesses under extreme load condition. And the 10th point, which is the scenario and component activity. So performance criteria should cover entire scenarios and individual component activities to ensure comprehensive testing coverage across all aspects of the application. And for an example, performance testing covers scenarios like user registration, login, search functionality, and checkout process, as well as individual component activities such as database queries and API calls. And now coming back to the KPIs, which we call as key performance indicators. So defining the KPIs helps measure and track the performance of the application against specific metrics, allowing for effective performance monitoring and analysis. So when coming to the example, so we track the KPIs such as average response time, throughput, error rates, and resource utilization to measure the application's performance against predefined targets. And now coming back to the previous release of the application. So by analyzing the performance data from the previous releases helps us to identify areas for improvement and set benchmarks for performance goals in the current release. And for example, I would say by analyzing the performance data from previous release will help us set benchmarks and identify areas for improvement in the current release. And now we are in the last part of this section where we discuss about the competitors application. So benchmarking performance against competitors application provides valuable insights into industry standards and best practices, which helps to set realistic performance criteria. And for example, we benchmark our application's performance against the competitors to ensure we meet or exceed industry standards and user expectations. And the 14th point, which is the optimization objectives. So, performance criteria should support optimization objectives aimed at improving system efficiency, scalability, and responsiveness. So performance criteria support optimization objectives, say for example, such as reducing page load times, optimizing database queries, and minimizing network latency to improve the overall system performance. And coming back to the safety factors and room for growth and scalability. So by building safety factors into the performance criteria will ensure resilience and stability under varying conditions, and planning for room for growth and scalability accommodates future expansion and increased user demand. And for example, so we build safety margins into performance criteria to account for unexpected spikes in traffic and plan for scalability to accommodate future growth. And then the 16th and the last point, which is schedule, staffing, budget, resources, and other priorities. So consideration of project constraints such as schedule, staffing, budget, and available resources helps us to prioritize performance testing efforts and allocate resources effectively to meet project objectives. For this, I would bring up an example where we allocate resources and prioritize performance testing efforts based on project constraints such as schedule, staffing, availability, and budget limitations. So, by considering all these key points and applying them in our performance testing efforts, we ensure that our application meets the desired performance standards and delivers an optimal user experience. And with that, I come to the end of this video. So I believe this video would be very informational and insightful. So please don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like and share the video with your friends. So until I meet you in another interesting video, it's bye bye from Vasan Shanmugam and Little Slaw.